Joining me now is the Labour MP Ian Murray. He's the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Mr Murray. Do you admire Mr Ross?
Well, I think Mr Ross is the only one in government with any integrity at the moment, and I think his letter that he's published on social media and that you'll be using today talks for the whole of the country. And the country have had huge sacrifices in terms of what they've been doing over the last 2.5 to 3 months, all the way through to not being able to attend the bedside of relatives who are passing away. And I think his letter speaks for the nation when he says that in all good conscience he cannot support the government's view on Dominic Cummings. It
is a difficult choice, though, for a politician because, there is a tendency to want to be loyal to the leader, and many people think you should be loyal to the leader if you've been elected under a particular banner.
Well, there is nothing in the rules in terms of Parliament and politics that says that you shouldn't stand up for your constituents, and integrity shouldn't be the watchword of the day. And Douglas Ross has shown integrity when Dominic Cummings, during the very arrogant press conference yesterday, showed no contrition, no apology, no integrity at all. And this goes right to the heart of Downing Street, right to the heart of the Prime Minister's administration, in terms of the whole of the public being very, very angry about what has happened, by having one rule for Dominic Cummings and one rule for the rest of the country. The government are undermining a hugely important message during a global pandemic, that people must abide by the instructions to keep themselves safe, to keep others safe, and to try and get through this crisis.
How much flexibility do you think there should be now in terms of the way in which people interpret the government guidelines?
Well, I don't think anybody should interpret the government guidelines. I think the government guidelines should be clearer. I think the one aspect of this entire crisis that everyone will have seen is the kind of communications from Downing Street have been confused. But the British public haven't interpreted these rules. They've stuck by them. They've stayed at home. They've abided by the lockdown. They've abided by the very strict rules of only taking exercise, and they will abide by the rules when lockdown starts to be eased, as we've just seen in your package and what the Prime Minister announced yesterday. But for the Prime Minister's closest advisor, someone who actually writes these rules, to so blatantly be flouting those rules, sends out a message to the public that they really don't matter, and that the public have to abide by the rules, but the government don't. And I think that's an incredibly difficult message to be sending out to the British public when everyone has to be working together to try and get through this crisis.
You are clearly critical of Mr Cummings' actions. Do you think his role is legitimate and acceptable in British democracy?
Well, I think we've seen over a number of instances over the last few months that the person who really does run the government is an unelected official. And I think why this is so important is because the Prime Minister is losing all moral authority, and his government's losing all moral authority. And that, in normal times, would be difficult for the country, but in times of global pandemic, it's a complete and utter disaster. And Boris Johnson should have done the right thing to maintain not just integrity in his own government, but to maintain the integrity of the very strict rules that he's put in place to make sure that we can save lives, because the bottom line, that is what this is all about. And everyone would have been surprised that we didn't just get an apology yesterday. We should have had a huge apology, not just from Dominic Cummings, but from the Prime Minister. But to be doubling down on what Dominic Cummings said yesterday just says to the public that they don't matter. And for Michael Gove to be touring the television studios this morning to say that a 60-mile round trip to Castle Bernard that Dominic Cummings took to test his eyesight was in some way allowable under the rules because he was preparing for work, just makes a mockery of the public, a mockery of the government rules, and undermines us all trying to work together to get out of this crisis.
There are those who say the last Labour government is to blame for the overmighty Mr Cummings because it promoted people like Alistair Campbell and Jonathan Powell.
Well, I think that's a slightly disingenuous thing to be trying to compare what Dominic Cummings has done to trying to run a modern and effective government with all the challenges that brings with it. And I think to try and compare previous governments to what Dominic Cummings has done undermines this incredibly serious issue. And I think that the Labour government, the Labour Party was absolutely right to write to the Permanent Secretary at the Cabinet Office to seek his guidance on what has happened here, and is quite right to continue to push on this, because it undermines the message. We've been quite clear from the start, and Keir Starmer has been very clear from the start, that we all want to work together. We're all rooting for all governments to get us out of this crisis as quickly and as safely as possible. But to undermine that message to the public just says quite clearly that the government has complete disregard for its own rules and treats the public differently than it treats itself. And that is a dreadful message to be sending out in normal times, letting on during a global pandemic.
Mr. Murray, thank you very much indeed for joining us.